Today, we're going to be talking about political participation, specifically in the state of Texas. Now, political participation in the United States has generally been pretty low, and it's generally pretty low in most major democracies, and it's even worse in a winner-take-all system, which is what we have, which is different than what a lot of other European countries have or other democracies have, such as proportional representation, where every time you vote, your vote goes to an individual. And so multiple people can actually win in that particular type of election, whereas winner take all, one person wins, and that's basically it. So you have either you win or you lose. Big difference between the two. Now, part of the problem with Texas is we have a history of really making it very difficult for people to actually vote. One of the processes that we use these days, and we're still using to this day, is voter ID laws, which is the concept of making sure that the people who actually show up, to actually vote at any particular time can actually produce a piece of identification that's accepted by the state, that tells them that they can actually vote and participate in that particular election. Sometimes it's very difficult for a lot of people to get, especially with minority groups and other people who basically don't have access to the same kinds of resources that pretty much the rest of the state actually does. And so quite often it's used, or has historically been used, as a mechanism to keep people from voting, rather than actually getting more people to actually participate. But over the years, due to Supreme Court challenges and court challenges and all sorts of different avenues that people have actually been able to take advantage of, more and more people are now able to vote, which is a really good thing. The problem with that is that doesn't translate to actual people showing up to actually vote. One of the problems we kind of run into with most elections, and this just isn't in Texas itself, is we have a tendency to get a whole bunch of people signed up to actually vote. So they're all registered. But then when the actual election comes around, getting them to actually show up and cast their vote is much more difficult. So you'll find a lot of areas that will actually do like car drives and stuff like that, to where they'll actually pick people up and take them to the voting polls. We don't have a lot of that in Texas, although in some of the bigger cities we might. So our voter turnout tends to be pretty dismal. And also kind of keep in mind, that's just for like presidential elections. So the every 4-year election. Now, when we talk about midterm elections, which is basically every 2 years. So you have your 4-year election, and then you got an election that happens 2 years after that. Those numbers are even more dismal than the previous ones, because people tend to look at it as, well, I'm not voting for a president, so why do I really care? And even though they have much more impact on the local people who are actually running, or the smaller numbers would actually make a bigger difference, they still don't participate. It's like they don't care if it's not a national kind of an issue or a national referendum. So how do we actually figure out if people are actually voting or not? Well, we use a couple of different scales to observe this, or to track it. We often use what's called the voting age population, which is often referred to as VAP, voting age population, VAP. And what that actually does is it measures anybody that's actually of the age that's capable of actually voting. So if you're over 18, you're counted into the numbers. And so they look at those numbers and go, how many people are actually voting? And is it everybody? Is it a very small percentage? Well, spoiler alert, it's usually a really small percentage. But then they actually started to realize that's not giving us consistent numbers of what we really are looking for, which is how many people should be able to vote, rather than how many people could potentially vote. Because think about it, if voting age population means anybody over 18, so that means people who are actually have been convicted, people who basically have no capability of actually voting, the mentally challenged, stuff like that. There's a whole bunch of different categories that still get lumped into those numbers that cause a bit of a problem when we're trying to calculate the numbers of people. So we have another scale that we created, which is VEP, which is the voting eligible population. Now, this means people who actually could vote. So if somebody's actually has been convicted of a crime, has done their time, and is no longer on probation, because probation is another one of those inabilities to be able to vote. But all of that stuff aside, that would make them voting eligible. So those numbers get counted. And so we try to look at those numbers and try to see how many people are actually consistently voting in every particular election. Now, like I said before, Texas's numbers are really, really low. And so that hasn't gotten any better. We've tried to get more people to actually vote, but generally we've not been very successful in actually doing it. Plus, every type of election we seem to be going forward with, we have a tendency to make it harder and harder for people to actually vote. So those numbers are going to keep going down. So kind of keep in mind that Texas has a history of limiting who can actually vote in the state. And we've gone through a lot of work since the founding of Texas itself to pretty much limit who actually gets a chance to actually cast their vote in any particular election. And so we're talking about, for the longest period of time, up until about 1923, it was very difficult for anyone that was not actually, white Anglo-Saxon male to actually vote in Texas. Not only that, about the 1920s or so, and all the way almost to the 1950s, it was very difficult for women to vote. And so even though constitutionally they were supposed to be able to vote, we put a lot of barriers into place to make it so a lot of people couldn't vote who should have actually been able to vote. Things are a lot better these days, but we still have a lot of kind of push and pull. So it's kind of one of those things to always kind of keep in mind. And it's why you'll see the media talking about it quite often. But those are the basics on political participation in Texas. Our numbers are low, doesn't mean they can't get better. Because keep in mind, the more people who participate, the more understanding we're going to have that this is a representation of the people who are actually being represented. And unfortunately, until those numbers start to increase and get better and a little more solidified, we're always going to be stuck with that system of where too few people are representing, too few people in the state.